They didn't just doubt her. They documented it. Asterisk, asterisk, there's a particular kind of cruelty that wears a professional face. It doesn't scream. It doesn't call names. It simply writes things down in neat handwriting, in official language, in ink that dries before you even leave the room. And when that ink dries on your file, on your assessment, on your future, and it says not enough, you carry that paper inside your chest for years. You carry it even when no one can see it anymore. You carry it when you're winning. You carry it when you're supposed to feel proud. This is the story of a girl they wrote off before she ever had a real chance. And then she took down 219 of them. Her name was Mira Nair. She was born in a mid-sized town in South India that had one good school, one decent hospital, and an absolute abundance of opinions about what girls should and shouldn't do with their lives. Her father drove an auto rickshaw for 23 years. Her mother stitched blouses from home, fingers moving in the low light of a single bulb after the children went to sleep. There were 3 children. Mira was the middle one, which meant she got neither the careful attention reserved for the eldest nor the soft indulgence given to the youngest. She got the space in between, the invisible slot. She was not, by anyone's early measure, exceptional. She was quiet in class in a way that teachers read as slow rather than careful. She asked questions too late, after the lesson had moved on, because she needed more time to turn an idea over in her hands before she trusted it. She got average marks in primary school. Good enough, never remarkable. Her handwriting was a disaster, looping and uneven, letters leaning into each other like they needed support. One teacher sent a note home when Mira was 9 years old that said, in careful, polite, devastating language, that Mira may not be suited for academic advancement, and that her parents should consider practical vocational tracks as she approaches secondary school. Her mother read the note twice, folded it, placed it in a small tin box where she kept important documents, birth certificates, ration cards, the receipt for her husband's auto loan. Mira found the note when she was 11. She read it standing in the kitchen, afternoon light coming through the window, her mother stirring something on the stove behind her. She didn't say anything. She folded it back exactly as her mother had folded it, put it back, went to her room. She didn't cry. That would come later, privately, in small doses years apart. What she felt in that moment was something stranger than sadness. It was the unsettling sensation of being categorized, filed, like she had been measured and found to be a standard size when she had always suspected, quietly, stubbornly, that she was something that didn't fit any of the standard boxes. She kept that suspicion. Secondary school arrived like a test she hadn't been told she was taking. The competition sharpened. The children who had coasted on charm and quick answers began to separate from those who could sustain. Mira was neither charming nor quick, but she had something no one had thought to look for. She was relentless about understanding things completely. She would not move forward on a concept she hadn't fully absorbed. She would reread chapters. She would draw diagrams in the margins. She would ask the question everyone else was too embarrassed to ask because they were pretending to already know. Her teachers found this irritating. One of them, a mathematics teacher with a precise mustache and a habit of tapping his chalk against the board when students disappointed him, told her in front of the full class that some students are simply not built for this level. He said it mid-lesson, in response to her asking him to re-explain a trigonometry concept that he had, frankly, explained badly the first time. The class went quiet. 32 students looked at Mira. Mira looked at the board. She wrote down the concept anyway. She went home and taught it to herself from the textbook. She got full marks on the chapter test. He didn't say anything about that. There's a pattern that repeats itself in the lives of people who are eventually called extraordinary. Before the extraordinary part, there's an ordinary stretch that feels less like a foundation and more like a sentence. Every day resembles the one before it. Progress is invisible. The work accumulates beneath the surface like groundwater. You can't see it, you don't know how much of it there is, and then one day the ground shifts and it all comes up at once, and people act shocked as if water came from nowhere. Mira's groundwater years lasted through secondary school, and into the gap year after she graduated. She hadn't qualified for the top engineering colleges on her first attempt. She missed the cutoff by 11 marks. 11. Not 100. Not a catastrophic failure. 11 marks that stood between her and the room where futures were shaped. 11 marks that, in the economy of entrance exams, meant one more year. A gap year. A year where everyone who had sat beside her moved forward and she stayed in place. Her extended family, with the precision of people who have never needed to worry about their own shortcomings, had a great deal to say about this. Her father said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came home, set his keys on the hook by the door, and told her that she would try again and that she would get in. He said it the way men like him say things. Not as comfort, not as strategy, just as fact, delivered in a voice that has already decided the matter. Her mother made her a cup of tea and sat across from her and asked what had been difficult in the exam. Not, why did you fail? Not, what will you do now? Just, what was difficult? Mira answered. They talked for 2 hours. Her mother, who had never finished secondary school herself, sat and listened and asked follow-up questions that were sharper than they had any right to be. By the end of it, Mira had a list. By the end of the week, she had a plan. The gap year was the first time Mira experienced what it felt like to be fully committed to a single thing. She had a routine so rigid it had its own gravity. She woke at 5. She studied for 4 hours before breakfast. She ate the same meal every morning. Rice, sambar, 1 egg, because decision fatigue about food was a luxury she couldn't afford. She studied through the afternoon. She took a walk at 6 because someone had told her once that the brain consolidates during rest, and she had decided to believe it. She studied again after dinner. She slept at 10. She did this for 11 months. She didn't go to friends' gatherings. She missed a cousin's wedding. She turned down the part-time tutoring work her uncle offered because she knew that if she split her attention, she would lose the accumulation she had been building. She was not popular during this period. She was not fun. She was something much more uncomfortable to be around. She was focused in a way that made other people feel vaguely accused. But she was also, for the first time, entirely herself. The girl who had been told she was not built for academic advancement spent 11 months building herself, brick by brick, concept by concept, until she was something the original assessment had no category for. The second entrance exam came on a Tuesday in May. Mira took a bus to the examination center at 6 in the morning. She wore a blue salwar she had pressed the night before. She carried 2 pens, extra pencils, her hall ticket, and her ID. She had eaten breakfast. She had slept. She walked into the room and sat down and did not look at the other students. She had stopped measuring herself against other people somewhere around the 8th month of her gap year. It had happened quietly, without announcement. She had simply realized one afternoon, mid-problem set, that the only exam she was actually taking was against a version of herself who had missed the cutoff by 11 marks. That girl was the opponent. The room full of other students was background noise. She opened the paper. She worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, completely, refusing to leave a question until she was satisfied with her answer. She finished with 12 minutes to spare. She checked her work. She changed one answer. She put her pen down. She walked out into the May heat and called her father from a payphone and said, "I think I did well." He said, "I know." The results came 3 weeks later. She had ranked in the top 5% of the state. She had not just cleared the cutoff. She had cleared it by a margin that put her in the range of colleges she hadn't even let herself name during the gap year, because naming them felt like tempting something she hadn't earned yet. She was admitted to one of the top institutions in the country. When the letter arrived, her mother stood in the kitchen and did not make a sound for a full minute. Then she went to the tin box. She took out the note. The one from when Mira was 9, not suited for academic advancement, consider vocational tracks. She held it for a moment. Then she tore it in half. Then in half again. She threw the pieces in the trash and went back to cooking. She never mentioned the note to Mira. She didn't have to. But here is the thing about Arrival. It doesn't end the story. It opens a new room with a higher ceiling and harder walls and people who got there more easily and will never let you forget it. Mira arrived at college and discovered that the gap year, the 11 marks, the quiet accumulation, none of it was visible on her face. All that was visible was that she had taken an extra year. And in environments built around speed, an extra year is the first thing people notice. She was 20 when her classmates were 19. She was told this once in a tone that was meant to be casual by a boy in her batch who had gotten in on his first attempt and wanted her to know it. He said it while they were waiting for registration, in the company of 4 others, in the voice of someone delivering trivia. Mira looked at him. She didn't say anything. She thought, "You have no idea what that year cost, and you have no idea what it built." She said nothing. She went to her room and unpacked her bag and arranged her books in the order she would need them. The competition had 219 students in her batch. She intended to be the one they remembered. Not because she needed to prove that note wrong. She had stopped needing that sometime in the gap year, somewhere around month 8, somewhere between the walk at 6 and the dinner study session. She needed to prove it to herself. That was different. That was everything. College is a specific kind of battlefield. Not the kind with visible wounds. The kind with invisible rankings, silent scoreboards, and a social architecture that decides your value in the first 3 weeks and then spend the next 4 years either confirming or revising that verdict. Mira arrived at the institution with 1 suitcase, 2 sets of bedding, and the particular posture of someone who has already been underestimated and decided to use it. The campus was enormous in the way that places built to impress are enormous. Large buildings, wide corridors, trees planted in deliberate patterns, a kind of arranged grandeur that said important things happen here before you had even opened a single textbook. The students who moved through it with ease were the ones who had grown up in cities with campuses just like this one, who had attended schools that prepared you not just for the coursework, but for the feeling of deserving to be there. Mira had grown up in a town with one good school. She had not been prepared for the feeling. The first semester hit her like a wall she had run straight into without seeing. Not the academics she could handle. She had spent 11 months becoming the kind of student who could handle the academics. What she hadn't prepared for was the pace at which everyone else seemed to already know everything. The students around her spoke in a shorthand she didn't have. They referenced things, schools, teachers, coaching centers, competitive circuits, the way people reference a shared history she hadn't been part of. They formed groups in the first week based on this shared history, and the groups had a density that left no obvious point of entry for someone who had come from somewhere else entirely. She ate dinner alone for the first 2 weeks. She used the time to study. Her first semester grades were strong. Not first in a batch, but solidly top 20%. Given that she was still learning the campus, still finding the library's best-lit corners, still navigating the unwritten politics of who sat where, and who you needed to know, top 20% was, by any reasonable measure, a good start. No one told her it was a good start. What she heard instead from a girl 2 rooms down who had finished in the top 5%. You'll need to push harder if you want to matter here. The girl said it without cruelty. That was the worst part. It was said as advice. Friendly, practical, take it or leave it advice from someone who genuinely believed that maturing was the goal and that harder was the method. Mira thanked her. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall. She thought about the 9-year-old in the kitchen holding that note. She thought about her mother tearing it up. Then she opened her books. The second semester was where things began to shift. She had found her footing by then, not in the social architecture, which remained largely closed to her, but in the only architecture she could actually build in, the academic one. She had mapped the library. She had identified the 2 professors whose thinking she respected enough to go to office hours, not to impress them, but to actually ask the questions she needed answered. She had built a study schedule that was different from the gap year schedule, because now she had more inputs, more complexity, and she had learned to adjust. She also had, by the second semester, discovered the one thing that would define the next 4 years of her life. Her department ran an internal ranking system. It wasn't advertised. It was the kind of thing that existed in the culture of a competitive institution without needing to be written down. Everyone knew, roughly, who stood where. The marks at the end of each semester were compared, discussed, analyzed with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things that actually mattered, which in a room full of 20-year-olds whose entire identity was built around being smart, marks absolutely did. 219 students in her batch. She was somewhere in the middle of that ranking at the end of her first semester. Not written off, but not visible either. The same invisible slot she had occupied her whole life. The middle, the space in between. She had decided quietly and without telling anyone that she was going to climb out of it. She didn't talk about this decision. She had learned, somewhere between the gap year and the first semester, that announcing goals was a way of spending the energy that should go toward achieving them. She had watched classmates declare intentions loudly and then find themselves exhausted by the performance of their own ambition before the actual work began. She just worked. Her method was not glamorous. It had no philosophy attached to it, no productivity system, no morning ritual with journaling and affirmations. It was simply the relentless application of attention to whatever was in front of her at any given time. She treated every exam, every assignment, every presentation as though it was the only one. Not in a frantic way, in a surgical way. She would identify what a task actually required, strip away what it didn't need, and then execute with the kind of precision that comes from spending a gap year learning the difference between studying hard and studying correctly. The third semester results put her in the top 15%. The fourth put her in the top 10. Something happens when you begin to move upward in a place that ranked you low. The people who didn't see you before begin to see you, but the seeing has a quality to it that is more unsettling than the not being seen. It comes with a kind of recalculation you can watch happening in real time. A narrowing of the eyes. A resorting. You can almost hear the internal spreadsheet updating. A boy in her batch. Not the same one who had mentioned the extra year, but another one from a wealthy family in a large city, one of the students who had entered the institution already knowing he belonged there, stopped her in the corridor after 4 semester results and said, "I heard you did well." "I did," she said. He waited, as though she would add something. Context maybe. Explanation. Some account of how she had arrived at well from wherever she had been before. She didn't add anything. She kept walking. By the end of the second year, there was a name for what she was doing, though she hadn't named it herself. The students around her began to call it, in the way that groups identify phenomena they can't quite explain, Mira being Mira. It was a phrase that meant she showed up, she worked, she climbed, she didn't explain herself, and none of us entirely understand the mechanism. Her social circle remained small. 2 people, specifically, whom she had found in the library in the second semester. Priya, who studied biochemistry and had a laugh that could have powered a small generator, and Suresh, who was studying the same track as Mira, and who had, unlike most of their batch, asked her questions about how she studied rather than about why she had taken a gap year. These 2 were her people. She didn't need more than that. She had never been the kind of person who collected friends the way others collected proof of being liked. She was the kind of person who found 2 people she could trust completely and then held them like a fact. Priya once asked her during a late library night in their 3rd year whether she ever got tired. Mira thought about it honestly. "Not of this," she said. "I get tired of the noise, not the work." Priya nodded like she understood, even though Mira suspected she didn't entirely. Very few people understood the difference, the noise being the doubt, the ranking talk, the recalculations in corridors, the polite advice that was really assessment. The work being the only place where none of that existed. Just the problem and the solution and the distance between them. The work was the quiet place. 3rd year arrived with a new dimension. Project work. This was where the institution separated students who could absorb and reproduce information from students who could actually think. The coursework had tested retention and understanding. The project year tested something harder, original application. Taking what you knew and using it to do something that hadn't been done before, done better than before, or done in a way that solved an actual problem. This was where Mira discovered she had an advantage no one had predicted. Her years of being the slow asker, the one who needed complete understanding before moving forward, had given her a kind of structural thinking that the faster students hadn't developed in the same way. They could move quickly through material because they had learned to tolerate partial understanding. They grabbed the shape of an idea and ran with it and filled in gaps later. Mira had never been able to do that. She had always needed the full architecture before she could build on it. In coursework, this had sometimes made her slower. In project work, it made her dangerous. She could see problems from their roots. She could identify where a solution would fail before it failed because she had built the entire logical chain in her head and could feel where it was weak. Her project supervisor, a professor who had been at the institution for 18 years and had seen every variety of student come through, told her in the second month of the project year that she had an unusual gift for structural thinking, and then immediately said nothing more about it, the way that precise people acknowledge something significant, and then let the acknowledgement stand on its own. She let it stand. She kept working. The project year also brought the national competition. Every major institution in the country sent their top project teams. The selection for their institution's team was competitive, 12 slots for a batch of 219. Mira applied. The selection panel was made up of 3 faculty members and 1 industry professional who visited once a year for this purpose. They interviewed each applicant, reviewed their academic record and project proposal, and made their decisions over 3 days. Mira had ranked 7th in the batch by this point. She had also, in the months of project work, produced a proposal that her supervisor described in the understated language of people who do not give compliments easily as notable. The proposal addressed a structural inefficiency in a process that had been done the same way for 2 decades, not because no one had noticed the inefficiency, but because the solution required thinking across 2 fields that were rarely connected to each other. Mira had connected them. She had connected them because in her second year, she had spent 2 extra months on a topic outside her core track that no one had asked her to study, simply because she had found a gap in her understanding and couldn't move forward with it there. The gap year instinct. Old habits. She was selected for the team. The night the selection was announced, she called her father. He picked up on the second ring. He always picked up on the second ring, as though he kept the phone nearby on days when news might come, which she realized then he probably did. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what happens next." She told him what the competition involved, where it would be held, what her team was proposing, how many institutions would be competing. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "You've been ready for this since the gap year. You just needed the right room." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She meant it. She had known, somewhere deep in the 8th month of that year, when the groundwater was high and the surface was still, that she was building towards something she couldn't see yet but could feel the shape of. She hadn't known it would look like this, but she had known it would come. The competition was 3 months away. She had 12 teammates, a proposal that needed refinement, and the quiet certainty of someone who had already taken down the hardest opponent she would ever face. That opponent had been the version of herself that almost believed the note. The 219 other people in her batch were almost beside the point. Almost. The 3 months before the national competition did not feel like 3 months. They felt like a single, long, continuous day that had been folded into 90 pieces and dealt out one at a time, each one indistinguishable from the last except by how tired everyone was by the end of it. The team worked in the late room, a project space on the 3rd floor that the institution had assigned to them, a room with whiteboards on 2 walls, and a persistent smell of cold coffee and marker ink that seeped into your clothes if you stayed long enough. Most of them stayed long enough. There were 12 of them on the team. 4 were from the top 5 of the batch rankings, the kind of students the institution always produced front and center when something important was at stake. The kind who had arrived at the institution already knowing they would end up here, in this room, selected, visible. They wore their selection like something they had been owed. Mira wore hers like a tool. The team dynamic fractured in the second week. It was not dramatic. It rarely is in the beginning. It started as a disagreement about approach. The four frontrunners wanted to present the proposal in a traditional framework, the kind that competition judges were familiar with, the kind that read as rigorous and credible and safe. They argued that novelty was a risk when your audience was a panel of established professionals who had seen every variety of student project and had their preferences calcified by experience. Mira argued the opposite. She said it in the flat, unhurried way she had developed over years of being the slow asker who turned out to be right, that the proposal's strength was precisely its novelty. That presenting it in a traditional framework was like putting a new engine in an old chassis and then wondering why no one noticed the engine. The panel would see the familiar shape and evaluate it by the standards of familiar things. The whole point was that this was not a familiar thing. The room was quiet after she said it. One of the top 5 students, a boy named Adifier, who had ranked second in the batch, and who spoke with the careful confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong in a room full of people, said, "With respect, judges don't want to be surprised. They want to be impressed." "Those are the same thing," Mira said, "when it's done right." Adifier looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something that is either stupid or correct, and they cannot immediately tell which. The team lead, a girl named Kavitha, who had the organizational mind of someone who had been preparing for leadership since she was 12, said they would table it and come back to it. This was the language of committees that do not want to make a decision yet. Mira knew it. She let it go for the moment. She came back to it later. She came back to it in the form of a 20-page document she produced over a weekend. Not an argument, just a working demonstration. She took their proposal and presented it twice. Once in the traditional framework Adifier had advocated, once in the approach she had been describing. She put them side by side. She let them read both without commentary. The team read it on a Monday morning. No one said anything for a few minutes. Then Kavitha said, "The second version is significantly better." Adifier looked at the document for a long time. He was the kind of person whose respect, once given, was genuinely given, which meant it cost something, which meant it was real. He said, "Okay, we go with her framework." He didn't say it easily. He said it correctly. That was the day the team stopped being 12 people in a room and became a unit. The work that followed was different from any work Mira had done before. Not because it was harder, but hard wasn't new. It was different because for the first time, she was building something with people who were as capable as she was in different ways, in ways that filled the gaps she had. Priya wasn't on the team, but Suresh was, and he had a mathematical precision in his work that complemented Mira's structural thinking the way a right angle complements a wall. Adifier, now fully committed, turned out to be a ferocious verbal thinker. He could hear a flaw in an argument the way a musician hears a missed note instinctively, without having to name the music theory behind it. Kavitha held them all together with the same energy she had probably deployed since childhood, organizing, synthesizing, keeping the timeline on the whiteboard updated with a different color marker for each week. The kind of person whose competence is so consistent it becomes its own form of calm. Mira learned things in those 3 months that 4 semesters of coursework had not taught her. She learned that the structural thinking that had isolated her for years, the need to build the full architecture before moving forward, was not just a strength in one-person work. It was a scaffolding that other strong thinkers could build on. She learned that her weakness in speed was not a weakness in the context of a team where other people were fast. She learned that the thing she had always experienced as a limitation was actually a foundation. This was not a comfortable thing to learn. Comfortable would have been discovering that she had been right all along about the best way to work. What she discovered was more complicated, that she had been right about the best way for her to work, and that the best way for her to work was most powerful when connected to other best ways. She filed this understanding in the part of herself that kept things for later. The competition was held in a large city she had never visited. The institution sent the 12 of them by train, A journey of 9 hours that felt, collectively, like a strange rehearsal for the event itself. All 12 of them occupying one carriage, talking through final adjustments, ordering tea from the trolley vendor every 2 hours, sleeping in the odd positions that train journeys produce. Mira slept 4 hours. She spent the other 5 looking out the window at the dark landscape moving past and running through the presentation in her head. Not nervously, just as maintenance. The way you check the engine before a long drive, not because you think something is wrong, but because you want to know that nothing is. Nothing was wrong. She had built this carefully. They had built this carefully. The architecture was sound. 23 institutions were competing. She had done the math. 23 institutions, each with teams of varying size, representing students who had all been told, in one way or another, that they were the ones who mattered. Some of them had been told this their entire lives, and believed it with the absolute comfort of people who have never had reason to doubt. Some of them had been told it recently by the selection process, and were still adjusting to the weight of it. Mira had been told the opposite of it at 9 years old, in a note that had lived in a tin box for 2 years before she found it. She sat in the large auditorium on the morning of day 1 and looked at the teams around her and felt, with a clarity that was slightly unsettling in its completeness, that she was not afraid. She was ready. There's a difference between confidence and readiness. Confidence is about how you feel. Readiness is about what you've built. Confidence can be manufactured. People fake it every day, productively, usefully, the performance eventually becoming the reality. Readiness cannot be manufactured. It is either there or it isn't. You know the difference from the inside, the way you know the difference between a room you've locked from outside and one you've locked from within. Mira was locked from within. Their presentation was scheduled for the afternoon of the second day. The first day was spent watching other teams. This was part of the competition design. All presentations were public. All teams could observe all others, the logic being that a genuine competition of ideas should be open. In practice, it meant that the first day was a chess match played in plain sight, each team assessing the others, recalibrating, adjusting. Mira watched 4 presentations in the morning session. 3 of them were excellent in the way that well-prepared, well-coached student work is excellent. Thorough, articulate, technically sound, and entirely predictable. The 4th was genuinely interesting. A team from the north that had tackled a problem in a field adjacent to Mira's that she hadn't considered before, and their solution had an elegance she respected. She leaned over to Suresh during that 4th presentation and said quietly, "They're good. Better than good," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's good for us." He looked at her. "We're not trying to be the best presentation," she said. "We're trying to be the one they remember." Different problem. He looked at the team on stage and then back at her and nodded slowly in the way that means, "I think I understand what you're saying, and I will trust it even if I don't entirely see it yet." The afternoon of the second day, they walked to the stage together, 12 people in a loose formation that Kavitha had not organized and did not need to. They had worked beside each other for 3 months. They knew each other's pace by now. They moved like a unit without thinking about it. Mira was presenting the first section and the final section. This had been her choice, quietly made, because the first section established the framework, and the final section was where the structural thinking that was the proposal's core strength lived. She wanted to hold both ends of the argument herself. Not for the credit, for the architecture. She needed the audience to hear the frame from the same voice that delivered the conclusion. She needed the logic to be a continuous thread. She stepped to the front of the stage. The room was large. 400 seats, roughly 300 of them occupied. The panel of judges, 7 of them, arranged at a long table to the left of the stage, had been watching presentations since 8 in the morning and had the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who are tired of being impressed in predictable ways. Mira looked at them. She began. She had been told, at various points in her life, that she was not suited for academic advancement. She had been told, in kinder language, that she should work harder, push more, be louder, be faster, be more. She had been given advice dressed as concern, and assessment dressed as advice, and dismissal dressed as assessment. None of it had prepared her for the feeling of standing in front of a room that was not yet listening, and then, within the first 3 minutes, becoming a room that was. She watched it happen. She had been told by people who taught public speaking that you should look at the audience to gauge their engagement. She had always done this naturally, not as technique, but because she was genuinely curious about whether what she was saying was landing. She could see the shift when it came. The small forward lean, the pins set down, the eyes that had been doing the polite, half-present thing that people do when they are waiting for something to interest them suddenly, doing the other thing. The other thing. The thing where they stopped waiting. She felt the room turn. She kept going. The proposal held for 45 minutes. Their time slot was 50 minutes, including questions. Suresh handled the technical deep dive, 15 minutes of precise, meticulous work that answered the questions the panel would have before they could ask them. Adifier handled the competitive landscape section, his verbal precision at its most useful, parsing the differences between their approach and existing solutions with the economy of someone who didn't need extra words to make a point. Kavitha coordinated transitions with the invisible competence of a person who has made complex things look simple for so long that the effort has become genuinely invisible. Then, the final section. Mira came back to the front. She addressed the structural argument. The reason why the framework they had built was not just a solution to the specific problem, but a template that could be applied to the class of problem it belonged to. This was the part that most student projects didn't reach. Most student projects solved the instance. This one addressed the type. She had built this section over 8 months of work, if you counted from the moment in the second year, when she had spent 2 extra months on the topic no one had asked her to study. She didn't count from there in the presentation. She just delivered what those 8 months had built. When she finished, the room held a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time in a competition auditorium. Then, the panel lead, a woman who had been in the industry for 30 years and had a reputation for asking questions that exposed the gap between what students understood and what they thought they understood, leaned forward and asked the first question. It was the right kind of question, not a challenge, an invitation. The kind you ask when you want to hear more. Mira answered it. Then the other questions came, 6 of them across the 5 remaining minutes. And she answered each one with the same quality of attention she had been applying to hard questions since she was a 9-year-old who needed to understand things completely before she could move forward. They were awarded first place. Not second, not honorable mention, not a participation certificate with a polite note about trying harder next time. First, out of 23 institutions. Hundreds of students. Years of preparation concentrated into a 2-day event. First, the announcement came at the closing ceremony on the evening of the second day. Kavitha heard it first. Her name was nearest the front, and her reaction was a sharp intake of breath that she would have been mortified about in any other context. Suresh closed his eyes for a moment. Adifier looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone confirming something they hadn't been sure they deserved to believe. Mira sat very still. She had a very specific sensation in that moment that she would spend years trying to describe and never entirely manage. It was not joy, exactly, though joy was part of it. It was not relief, though some relief was in it. It was the feeling of a long equation, finally, balancing. The feeling of a structure holding the weight it was built to hold. The feeling of the groundwater finally coming up. She thought of her father, who had kept the phone nearby. She thought of her mother, who had asked what was difficult. She thought of the tin box. She thought of the note, not with anger, with something that had no clean name, a kind of distant acknowledgement of the distance traveled. She had carried that note inside her chest for a long time, not because it defined her, but because it was the first formal document of the world's opinion of her. And the world had been wrong in a way that was so complete and so specific that the wrongness had become almost useful. It had given her something to push against, a surface, a resistance. You need resistance to build strength. Every person who has ever trained for anything knows this. The weight pushing back is how the muscle grows. That note that teacher, those 11 marks, that gap year, those corridor recalculations, those polite assessments, all of it had been the weight. She had grown. When she called her father that night from the hotel, he picked up on the second ring. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, the same moment as before, the same beat before the thing he was going to say. Then, he said, "Did you eat dinner?" She laughed. The laugh came out bigger than she expected, the kind that fills a hotel room in a way that makes the walls feel temporary. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Come home soon." That was all. No speech. No accounting of the journey. No inventory of the obstacles cleared. Just come home soon. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed after she hung up and thought about how the simplest things are often the ones that carry the most weight. She graduated the following year at the top of her batch. Not top 5, not top 10, top 219 students in that batch. She had come in at the middle of them. She had climbed, not quickly, not dramatically, not in a single transformation scene that could be edited into a highlight reel, but steadily, completely, with the structural patience of someone who understood that what you build from the bottom holds better than what you are handed at the top. At the graduation ceremony, the faculty member who read her name used the word distinguished. Mira's mother, sitting in the third row, heard the word and did not look around to see if anyone near her had heard it too. She didn't need anyone to hear it. She already knew what that word was worth. She had known since the afternoon she tore a small, polite, devastating note into 4 pieces and dropped it in the kitchen trash and went back to cooking. She had known it was worth exactly nothing. What Mira had built, the gap year, the groundwater, the structure, the climb, that was worth something. That had always been worth something. It was just that no one had thought to look for it at the start. They were looking now. There is a particular kind of injustice in being written off early. It does not announce itself as injustice. It arrives in the form of neutral language, in the considered opinion of people with credentials, in a measured assessment of professionals who are doing their jobs and believe they are being fair. And sometimes they are being fair by the metrics they have. The problem is that the metrics don't measure everything. They measure what you've done and assume it predicts what you will do. They measure speed and assume it indicates capacity. They measure the present and assume it contains the future. They missed the groundwater. They missed it in Mira. They will miss it in others. They are missing it right now in some 9-year-old somewhere, sitting in a kitchen holding a folded piece of paper, reading about herself in someone else's words, deciding, in the quiet that comes after a decision is made before it is spoken, that she's going to prove the metrics wrong. Not for the people who built them, for herself. That is the only reason that ever works. That is the reason that took Mira Nair from a note in a tin box to the top of a room full of people who had been told their whole lives that they were the ones who mattered. She had been told the opposite. And she had come anyway. And she had come first.